The film opens with a premise that doesn't waste time trying to reinvent horror. Instead, it brings you straight into the world of a security guard named Mike, a guy who clearly has more problems than just bills to pay. He's struggling financially, he's fighting for custody of his younger sister, and he's one step away from collapsing under the pressure of just existing. His desperation is essentially what drives him into accepting a night shift job at a rundown family entertainment restaurant called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a place that feels like it died decades ago and nobody bothered to bury it. From the moment he arrives, the environment looks wrong, not cartoonishly scary but genuinely depressing and abandoned, like a nostalgic 80s childhood fantasy that aged into a nightmare no one wants to remember. The movie doesn't pretend this place is a funhouse of jump scares. It portrays it as a graveyard of unrealized dreams, poor design decisions, and unresolved trauma, both for the characters and for the children who used to visit it before something sinister happened behind all the colorful paint and plastic smiles. Mike's character is constantly overshadowed by his past trauma, specifically the disappearance of his younger brother, a mystery that shaped his entire life and personality. This disappears from the front door scenario is presented not as a mystery box gimmick, but as a psychological weight, and the movie keeps coming back to it in recurring dream sequences. Some people praise these dream scenes for adding psychological depth. Others call them repetitive and slow. Both sides have a point. The dreams are atmospheric and they explain Mike's obsession with trying to interpret every moment before the kidnapping happened, but they also stall the packing and distract from the horror that audiences expected. The movie tries to walk a line between supernatural horror and emotional drama, and depending on who you ask, it either succeeds in being layered or fails to commit to either direction. The animatronics, which are the main selling point of the franchise, are presented not as evil robots created by a mad engineer, but as children's souls trapped inside rusty machines, a dark extension of unsolved crimes that the public ignored. This comes directly from the creator Scott Cawthon's original concept, where the horror isn't about robots malfunctioning, but about innocence corrupted and parental negligence allowing monsters to thrive. In the movie, the animatronics don't just attack randomly, they behave like manipulated children who don't understand morality. Their violence isn't driven by sadism but by corrupted loyalty, which is arguably more disturbing than if they were purely murderous machines. The visuals of the animatronics are grounded, not cartoonish CGI. Jim Henson's Creature Shop was involved in creating the physical puppets, which was a major production decision because digital creatures would have destroyed the nostalgic authenticity. The practical effects carry weight, shadows, dust, and imperfections, which automatically makes them feel more alive and unpredictable. People who actually know horror know this. CGI ages badly, and physical puppets age into icons. That decision alone might be the best production choice in the film. Mike's relationship with his little sister, Abby, is a core emotional thread instead of a token child character thrown into a horror film to raise stakes. Abby is not just someone to protect. She's almost disconnected from reality, interacting with the world in a detached way because she's grown up surrounded by grief, instability, and trauma she's too young to articulate. Her innocence is the reason she is accepted by the animatronics. This is not accidental writing, even though many people misunderstand it. Kids don't fear monsters in the same way adults do. They treat them as living things with personality. The film uses that logic, and Abby becomes a bridge rather than a victim. Her ability to communicate with the animatronics represents something Mike has lost: trust, imagination, and the ability to see something beyond cynicism. The villain of the film is William Afton, played by Matthew Lillard, who carries a layered performance that shifts from seemingly calm and unassuming to deeply manipulative. The movie doesn't spend long scenes explaining his motivations, because the film assumes you already understand the darkness of a person who preys on children. The less explained, the more unsettling. His reveal in the film is predictable if you know anything about the games, and even somewhat predictable if you don't. But predictability is not actually a problem, execution is. Lillard brings enough charisma and menace to sell the role without turning it into a cartoon villain. A major flaw is packing. The film spends too long on character psychology and not enough on escalating tension. Horror films work on rhythm: build, release, repeat. FNAF takes too long between threats. The early scenes create atmosphere, but then the middle section slows down to crawl. For fans of character-driven horror, that's acceptable, but mainstream audiences expected chaos and they didn't get it. The movie's internal logic is that trauma binds people more strongly than fear, and monsters are created by unresolved pain rather than supernatural randomness. The issue is that the film doesn't communicate that theme clearly. It forces the audience to interpret it themselves. A horror film that requires thematic interpretation is going to divide people. There are also factual production constraints worth mentioning. Blumhouse produced the film on a relatively low budget for a major franchise, estimated under $25 million, which means the movie couldn't afford large-scale destruction, CGI spectacle, or multiple complex set pieces. The film relies heavily on a single main location and minimal visual effects. This explains the repetitive setting and limited action scenes. This is not laziness, it's economics. Low-budget horror succeeds when it focuses on tension and atmosphere, not spectacle. But this film aimed to satisfy both general audiences and game fans, and that conflicting expectation resulted in compromises on both ends. Thematically, the story revolves around memory, trauma, and denial. Mike's obsession with replaying the past symbolizes the human inability to accept that some tragedies have no explanation, no closure, and no meaning. Afton's murders are not driven by philosophy, they're random acts of cruelty. The animatronics are victims forced into the role of monsters. Mike is a survivor who cannot move forward. Abby is the only character who still believes in emotional connection, and that belief becomes both her vulnerability and her power. The film attempts to comment on cycles of violence without using explicit gore or sensationalism. Whether you appreciate that maturity depends on what you expect from a horror movie. There are behind-the-scenes facts that explain some of the creative choices. Scott Cawthon, the creator of FNAF, had an unusual amount of control for a video game adaptation. Most game-based movies are created by studios who rewrite everything and discard the source material's internal logic. In this case, Cawthon co-wrote the script and had veto power over direction. This is why fans say the movie is faithful and critics say it's inaccessible. A fan-driven adaptation will always sacrifice mainstream clarity to preserve lore. FNAF's lore is intentionally convoluted and pieced together through fragments, theories, and hidden clues. Translating that into a traditional film was always going to alienate people who want narrative straightforwardness. The film leans into nostalgia, not as a cheap trick, but as a lens to observe decay. The restaurant is designed like a memory that refuses to die, a childhood relic that's physically rotting but culturally immortal. Animatronics are not haunted because ghosts exist, they're haunted because nobody let the dead rest. This concept is rarely addressed directly, but it underpins every visual: worn fabric, chipped paint, faded posters, and dark spaces where childhood joy used to live. The movie tries to weaponize nostalgia by showing how easily innocence becomes grotesque when neglected. The third act attempts to raise stakes, but it suffers from predictable plotting and underdeveloped suspense. The final conflict, although functional, lacks the emotional weight the script spent so much time building. The resolution prioritizes closure over shock, which makes sense narratively, but underdelivers for horror fans who wanted escalation, brutality, and stronger consequences. The acting, however, remains consistent. Josh Hutcherson carries the film by playing a guy who is too exhausted to be scared, which makes his tension feel grounded. He isn't a hero, he's tired. The animatronics, despite being enormous mechanical beings, are portrayed with a sense of tragedy that prevents them from becoming one-dimensional monsters. Matthew Lillard, though limited in screen time, brings enough personality to remind the audience that evil can hide behind friendliness, humor, and authority. When looking at audience versus critic reception, the divide is predictable. Critics rated the film low due to packing, lack of scares, and thin characterization. Fans rated it high because it respected the source material and delivered physical animatronics instead of cheap CGI. Financially, the movie was a major success, performing way above expectations. For a low-budget horror adaptation, breaking box office records is not normal and shouldn't be overlooked. Commercial success matters because it reflects real audience interest, not curated critic opinion. If there is one clear takeaway, it's that Five Nights at Freddy's is not designed to terrify people who seek horror innovation. It's made for a specific fanbase that values loyalty, atmosphere, and lore preservation over cinematic risk. The film is not brave, not groundbreaking, and not structurally tight, but it is competent, visually consistent, and self-aware. It doesn't apologize for being weird, tonally conflicted, and lore-heavy. It also doesn't dilute itself to win over people who don't care about the franchise. That stubbornness is both its weakness and its strength. It limits its audience but protects its identity. The movie positions childhood entertainment as a breeding ground for horror, not because mascots are scary, but because industries built on targeting children are rarely transparent about what goes on behind the curtains. The animatronics don't represent robots gone wrong. They represent children abandoned by systems that pretend to protect them. In that context, Freddy's doesn't need to be frightening to be unsettling. It only needs to be believable enough to mirror real atrocities disguised as innocent fun. The film succeeds in building that metaphor even if the delivery lacks power. Ultimately, Five Nights at Freddy's is more interesting as a cultural artifact than as a standalone horror film. It's Its existence proves that internet-born franchises with niche fanbases can translate into mainstream cinema without losing their identity. But it also exposes the limitations of adapting puzzle box storytelling into linear film. It is flawed, uneven, occasionally dull, but also ambitious, carefully constructed, and visually committed to authenticity. It is a film that works primarily for people already invested in its mythology. For everyone else, it's a strange experiment that misses conventional expectations. For a franchise that built its success on mystery, paranoia, and community-driven theory culture, the movie serves as a statement of preservation rather than reinvention. It doesn't rewrite its legacy, it merely dramatizes it. Whether that's satisfying or disappointing depends entirely on what you value more, artistic growth or loyal representation. The film chooses loyalty, and that decision defines every strength and every flaw it has.